So, hello, I'm Kitty Stryker, and I am the editor of Ask Building Consent Culture. I'm pretty sure that this video is not mirroring, but I might fix that in post. Who knows? Um, I edited this book in 2017. It's a collection of essays done by a bunch of marginalized writers, or mostly marginalized writers. I did that very purposefully because I feel like when we talk about consent culture, we typically only hear from white, cisgendered sex educators. And that felt very narrow to me as a white cisgendered sex educator. So I said to myself, like, what I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure that in Ask, I had a variety of different voices and that we talked about consent culture not only in the area of sexuality, but also in things like the workplace or in the medical industry, things that we don't always talk about consent culture in the same way. We don't see it as a spectrum. We see sex and consent and maybe relationships and consent in this one area. And then other types of consent are often talked about in a very legalese kind of way. So I wanted to confront that and do something different. And hopefully, I think I did that with Ask. If I was to edit this book again, I would do it slightly differently next time. Um, but I feel like it ends up being a very interesting collection of essays from a lot of different types of people. I didn't try to make them all sound the same. I didn't want to push an ivory tower on the reader or on the writers. And so I think you get a variety of different tones. And I mean, this is by no means exhaustive, but I picked a few different bits that I thought were very interesting. So I'm going to read a bit and then I'm going to tell you why that was important to me. So let's begin. I'm going to actually start from the end and work my way to the beginning because why not? It's my book event. I can do that if I want to. So this is a paragraph from Carol Queen, who wrote the afterword for Ask, and was very excitingly one of the first people who said yes to doing something for this book when I first conceptualized it. It took me years to actually come through and make it happen. And I was really grateful that Carol Queen was still excited to be a part of the book. Yeah, so here we go. In sex negative and sexist culture, you can't be a sexually curious and adventurous woman and be guaranteed respect and safety. This is the heart of the impulse towards slut shaming. And it's no surprise that slut shaming has seen a high profile uptick of late, nor that it has become so politicized. Sex, historically, and certainly in a rape culture context, is supposed to be dangerous. Does this statement seem outrageous to you? Then perhaps you are new to this struggle or you haven't been paying attention to unwritten but ever present cultural rules. Sex is supposed to be dangerous. This is the way it's always been. This belief explains our culture's problems with reproductive rights, too. Just as the election revealed deep cracks in other progressive gains, racial and LGBT rights are two of these things, we see in the consent versus rape culture struggle a worldview difference that, depending on how the die falls, will shape our lives in profoundly different ways. This is a fundamental political question. Maybe the very wellspring of the personal is political, and will be even if an individual's only use for constant knowledge is to have a more pleasant sex life. But, especially for women and queers, a pleasant sex life has never been a given. Hence, both sex education and consent culture are even more political than they appear from the outside. I included that because I feel like that is fundamentally one of the issues I was tackling with my consent culture work. I've been doing this work For a very long time. I think I've been doing it purposefully for about 10 years. And for me, I was realizing that I was in a supposedly sex positive community, but that sex positivity didn't tend to extend out to everybody equally within that community. I heard from a lot of trans people and from people of color that they felt misrepresented, if represented at all. And oftentimes they felt their sexual and social capital was undervalued or sometimes not valued at all. And as a fat person within those contexts, I felt much the same way. And it made me begin to think about what were the ways in which social structures impacted sex positivity? And what were the ways in which sexism had kind of gotten a hold of sex positivity? I would get accused of not being sex positive if I didn't put out, which seemed like the antithesis of sex positivity and actually just an awful lot like the patriarchy. But I was being told that if I was sex positive, that would be something I'd want. Now, spoiler alert, 10 years later, I identify as asexual. So that probably had something to do with it as well. But it did make me think about what were the ways in which we presented consent to other people. And were we really aware of the ways in which we were coerced under a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy? It's an awful lot to think about. It's heavy, like, we wanna think that consent's simple, it's yes or no, but there's a lot of ways in which our culture really prevents us from being in that place, and the more marginalized you are, the harder it becomes. So, I feel like that little bit from Carol Queen really manages to address that in a way that I found particularly interesting. Another piece here. This is, let's see the title here. This is Sex is a Life Skill, Sex Ed for the Neuroatypical by Says Thomason. And I should, um, to give a content warning, I have tried to pick things that didn't talk in detail about sexual assault, um, or violence, but it does come up sometimes in this book. And so I just want to offer that. If anybody feels the need to leave and come back or anything like that, that's totally fine. Don't feel bad for me. I'm good. Like, I totally accept that. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. I did try to make sure that I wasn't going to be hitting any buttons, but some of these do talk about sex, some of these do talk about rape culture. If any of those things are a problem, like, please do take care of yourself. I should have said that in the very beginning, um, but I'm going to give that warning now just in case. Anyway, back to Sex is a Life Skill, Sex Ed for the Neuroatypical by Says Thomason. I tell the kids all the things I was angry I'd not been told. We talk about sexual pleasure, about different kinds of orgasm, about penises and vaginas and what our bodies might do when we feel sexy. We talk to them about saying no and saying yes. We eat snacks and we talk about how it would not be okay to force feed anyone a snack they did not want to eat just then. We talk about the ways our bodies and faces might be saying no and how we listen to all the ways we tell each other what is and isn't okay. We talk about whom to talk to if something doesn't seem right or someone is making us feel unsafe. We talk about rape. We talk about abuse. Yes, we talk about HIV and pregnancy and condoms. We talk about gender and sexuality and all the different ways people can have sex. We talk about asexuality. And they are never too young and they are never too disabled. And as people who have very often had their autonomy violated, as teenagers with crushes and fantasies and changing bodies, as people with long term conditions controlled by medication, They, more than most, will understand all of these things. If only someone takes the time to teach good sexual health and well being as a life skill. Now, I added that because I think this is something that's really, really important to me. The understanding of having as much autonomy as you can have under the constraints that you're under. Um, I don't believe personally that under a patriarchal, capitalist, white supremacy, it is possible to have 100% consent ever. Um, that does not take anyone off the hook, however. In fact, I think it puts everybody on the hook all the time because if you realize that consent is not possible, that 100% consent is not possible when you're constantly dealing with various types of coercion, both subtle and direct, then instead the impetus becomes to understand that you might always be wrong. And it also becomes a situation where you realize that at any time you could potentially have your consent violated in a variety of different ways. Like, I think this addresses, like, I like the way that Says talks about it's not okay to force feed anyone a snack that they didn't want to eat just then. I think that that's a really nice way to put it because it doesn't mean that you don't want a snack. It doesn't mean that you'll never eat a snack again, but it does suggest that we shouldn't push these snacks on other people. Um, I also I feel that people with disabilities and people who are neuroatypical, we tend to take away their ability to consent because we feel like if they can't 100% consent, then they shouldn't be allowed to make those choices at all. That's part of why I like the framework of understanding that 100% consent is not possible in a coercive society. The best you can do is getting as close to that as you possibly can. Um, Yeah, so I feel like that's a really important thing, not only to talk about with people who are neuroatypical, but for everybody. I mean, we're all dealing with that all of the time. I may not feel comfortable saying that I'm not in the mood if I said that I wasn't in the mood yesterday. It could be as simple as that. It could be coercion that I'm putting on myself. But those aspects are there, and I think it's better to recognize that and look at that rather than try to avoid it or pretend that it's not a problem at all. So this next paragraph is from Games, Role Playing, and Consent by Kate Fractal. Ultimately, consent culture is not made by any one person, but rather is something we all have a say in. As organizers and leaders, we can normalize asking for consent by providing convenient times and ways to do so, while remembering that consent culture also means trusting the players to create the game that they want. As players, we can prioritize communicating our boundaries and desires and taking care of ourselves. All of us can support rather than shame people who break out of character to express their limits, and we can all thank people who ask for what they want. This is a piece that's about LARPing, live action role play in particular, but I really love it because I appreciate how it talks about that consent culture involves all of us. We all need to be a part of it for it to work. And that we all get to say what consent culture means to us and like what kind of environment we want to find ourselves in. I appreciate again, I mean, I'm an anarchist, okay? Sue me. Like, I love anytime we're talking about personal autonomy and taking accountability for ourselves and taking responsibility for each other. Like, it's not a surprise to anyone, I don't think, that I really hate the idea of like poly-libertarianism, this idea that everybody's an island and my feelings don't impact you ever in any way, and your feelings don't impact me ever in any way. That's just not true. We impact each other all the time. Maybe idealistically that wouldn't happen, but we're human beings. Of course, like your bad mood affects me and vice versa, no matter how much I try to deal with it. So, like, again, I think it's better to deal with the way things actually are rather than focusing on an unachievable ideal. Have the unachievable ideal in mind, certainly, but like, let's recognize that that's what that is, that we're not there yet and we may never get there. And let's find ways to encourage a consent culture right now here on Earth. Um, I also want to say if you are in the Zoom chat and you have a question or anything that you wanted to ask, if any of these bring something up for you, feel free to submit a question in the chat. You can also submit it to me directly if you don't want to be public about it. I will address questions anonymously, so don't worry about that. I okay, another piece. Fat phobia and consent: how social stigma mitigates fat women's autonomy by Virgie Tovar. In the case of fat women, the culture offers us an unacceptable ultimatum: become thin or disappear. If you do not consent to the terms, you are fair game. The idea that stigmatized groups are asking for it when we engage in behaviors deemed inappropriate for our status isn't new. This idea maps onto the neoliberal notion that is a cornerstone of of American life. Freudian slip there. Bootstrapping. Bootstrapping gains traction through the imagined notion of consent. It argues that we are all given an equal chance at success, and that if we do not achieve success, it is because we did not desire success enough. This ideology has strong roots in the current version of US capitalism, but it is not the only area of personal finance that we see this ideology manifest. Bootstrapping is also the basis for dieting. It is through dieting that we indicate to the culture at large that we have consented to fat phobia and we are willing to live under the terms of bigotry. When we refuse to consent to that, we are considered hostile and become targets of regulation. Now this is interesting because this is an area that I have obviously a lot of intense personal experience in. I like this idea of bootstrapping at its core being a type of coercion. And I feel like that is very true. Like I think that's not just true about fatness, it's true about whiteness, it's true about femininity and gender roles. It's true about assimilating into the culture. It's true about all these different things. And the idea that if you want to succeed, if you want to become thin, if you want to become accepted, if you want to be popular or loved, then you just need to desire it enough to make yourself fit in this very specific and contained sort of way. Um, and I think that, yeah, it's an idea that problematizes consent. I think it says, like, I like this bit here where it's like, dieting indicates to the culture at large we've consented to fat phobia. It's again one of those things that we aren't consciously thinking about. I consent to this. This is something that I am accepting for myself. But it is still a way in which we signal to the world at large that I would say not so much that we consent to this fat phobia, but that we are effectively coerced by it, that we are unwilling to fight back because it is too devastating to do so in some capacity. Another piece here. I'm trying to focus mostly on pieces that weren't specifically about sexual consent because I feel like sexual consent gets talked about a lot. It's really important, obviously, but it's not the only area. And a lot of what I wanted to do with this project and with hashtag I do consent in general is talking about consent culture and other aspects of our lives. So this is Giving Birth When Black by Tekala Rivera. Many white birth activists' solution for decreasing Black infant mortality and cesarean rates and increasing Black women's breastfeeding rates are to train and place more doulas and midwives in low income communities. However, this solution is not a solution at all. It is merely the white savior complex wrapped in cultural appropriation and classism. Doula trainings from governing bodies, such as DANA, are ridiculously expensive, which locks out many low income women and women of color from the profession. Also, many white doulas do not cater to or market to lower income women of color, especially with services that range from $800 to $2,500. And many white doulas feel that offering pro bono doula services to low income women of color would be devaluing the doula profession. But the doula profession was devalued long ago when veteran and highly experienced Black doulas and midwives were pushed out of their professions by Eurocentric literacy tests and westernized medical standards. This is like one of my favorite pieces in the book because I feel like pregnancy in particular and the medical industry generally is an area that consent is so often talked about in this very legal sort of way, but there are so many ways in which medical consent is complicated. And I appreciate that Tikala talks about how the coercion in this case comes from a systematic situation where it's not that Black women are consenting to this very white Eurocentric idea of the birthing experience. It's that they literally cannot choose anything else. And that is, I mean, I think that's something that we in the United States, in particular, with our shitty healthcare system, are very aware of. Like, we may not get to consent to the therapist that would best suit us or the muscle treatment that would be best for our bodies. We can only pick from very limited options most of the time. And we can only pick from the options that we can afford and that are made accessible to us. So I think like that's an interesting area of consent culture that I honestly could write. There could be a whole book in that, just that. Let's see. This piece is Bodily Autonomy for Kids by Akila S. Richards. Some parents tend to direct their child on how they should interact with a new adult instead of watching and seeing how their child responds to them and going from there. That's an example of intuitive interference. In order for a child to develop a sense of trust in their own intuition, we as parents have to respect their choices and decide on a safe place and time to discuss the interaction and see if our child has questions. This is where we as parents can be advocates and allies for our children. So, full disclosure, I'm going through a breakup right now. And one of the things that has been really difficult is getting back in touch with my sense of intuition. And I think a lot of adults have taught myself not to trust my gut, that I'm too skittish or I'm too quick to make a judgment call. And actually, my gut is often right. My gut feeling generally tells me that something is wrong, whether it's that I need some time to think or I need to have a conversation. My gut is usually pretty accurate that I need to slow down. But I think like as this piece says, I think it's something that we train out of ourselves and also our family dynamics and the way in which schools encourage us to like respect authority at all costs creates situations where we don't trust ourselves as much as we trust external factors. And obviously, that's going to negatively impact a consent culture because it's going to affect how we consent. Our consent then becomes variable according to the consent we are allowed to have, I guess, from an external factor. Um, which again is why I think it's so important to talk about consent, not just in the bedroom, but also in things like the workplace or the hospital, because I feel like the lessons we learn outside of the bedroom are going to impact the way that we treat consent inside the bedroom. And I don't see those types of consent as very different. I see them as, I wouldn't say it's a spectrum. I think it's more of a sphere. And I guess at some point I should figure out what the XY axis is on that, or like what that sphere is made up of. But I think that they are part of the same thing. And have seen, and like this book in particular showed me that there's a lot of ways in which consent is impacted, our understanding of consent, our ability to consent is impacted by so many daily interactions. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think it's really complicated. And like, I think one of the things I found really interesting when I was looking at reviews for Ask is there were some people who were frustrated that I didn't provide an answer. And that's fair. I get that. I think that generally, this is probably the kind of book that would end up sort of maybe in pop psychology or maybe in self help. It's like not very clear because I don't think that consent culture is very clear. And yeah, I very specifically did not want to give anybody any answers. I don't consider myself an expert. I'm there with you figuring this shit out. I've been figuring it out for years and I will forever be figuring it out. And I think that's a great thing. I think it's so much more accessible when we think about consent as something that is a living document that we're always learning. Yeah, I think that kind of sums it up. Um, I'm going to give it about 5 minutes to see if there's any questions that people would like me to answer. And I'll just sort of ramble, I guess, until then. um, so Ask the book came out through Thorn Tree Press, and I'm hoping I'm like putting together a proposal to do a workbook to go alongside it because I do think that while I don't feel that I could provide an answer for what consent looks like or how to do consent culture, I think that I have become a bit of an expert on figuring out what questions to ask. And so I'm hoping to provide some sort of document with a bunch of questions for people to ask themselves, to ask their partner. Again, not just thinking about consent culture at work, or sorry, in the bedroom, but also at work or, in education and dealing with, their children in hanging out with your cat, like consent culture impacts so many things. I will say that I was washing my dishes earlier today and I was thinking about this essay I read once about consent culture and how cats were really good around learning consent because you have to learn their body language. Um, and I was thinking about how, like, that's true for consent coming from me to the cat, but the cat does not care about my consent in any way. Like, the cat, if he wants to be on my lap, drooling on my face, there's not a whole lot I can do about it. Um, so yeah, so maybe I need to write a consent culture book for cats. um, so one question I got: if you could edit this book again or release a second similar book, are there any categories of essay you'd like to include? Actually, if I was to do a follow-up consent culture book that was not a workbook, what I really, really, really want to do, and this is going to take a lot of fundraising, but I would like to do a book that talks about consent culture around the world. Um, I know that there are people doing consent culture work in India, in Brazil, in Peru, in Japan, in China. And I am so interested to understand what consent culture looks like in other cultures. I think that so much of this conversation is so focused on Eurocentric ideas of consent. And I think that for us to really tackle the question of consent culture, we need to step away from the things that we believe to be universal. And for a lot of white people, we think that our Eurocentric ideas about consent are universal, and they're not. Um, just when it comes to family dynamics. And again, that individualism, you saw that a little bit around mask wearing and Americans' insistence on, freedom, the freedom to not wear a mask over anything else. While when I did an essay on mask wearing, um, I saw this thing about how Chinese communism was part of the reason why mask wearing became such a norm. Like there was a concentrated effort to see mask wearing as something that you do for the health of your community, that you were a part of your community and you whatever your personal thoughts were, you were doing this for your community. I was like, wow, what an interesting way to think about consent and like coercion and responsibility, and how different it is when you have your core value being freedom versus your core value being community. So, yeah, so if I was to do another consent culture book, I absolutely would want to do one that talks to other people. And what I would want to do, I mean, I would want to sort of be the editor pulling it all together, but I would like for each continent to have an editor that is local to that continent. So that way I, as a white person, am not trying to edit outside of the context of my own culture. Um, so I would want to pay all of those editors for their work. And yeah, I think it would be a really interesting selection of ideas. And I'm just so interested to see what consent culture looks like outside of the United States and the UK, which is what so much of it is. So one more second for questions. Okay. Well, I think then that is good. And I really appreciate you for coming and showing up. And thank you for letting me record this so that, I can post it up on YouTube so other people can hear it if they want to. Um, yeah. I really appreciate you taking part of your Saturday out to check out this little book reading. And I hope you check out the book. And I'm very accessible. You can find me at officially Kitty Stryker on Facebook. On Twitter as Kitty Stryker. On Instagram as Kitty underscore Stryker because I showed my nipples once and Instagram doesn't like that. Yeah, and hopefully you'll pick up a copy of Ask Building Consent Culture if you haven't. Get one for your friends. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.